If you would like to support the efforts and research we are doing here on this podcast, make a donation using the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes or go to buymeacoffee.com/Shane's Brain. Thank you. Aphantasia is a condition characterized by an inability to visualize mental images in one's mind. If you have just discovered that you or someone you love has aphantasia, or if you're just fascinated by the subject in general and love learning more about it, you are in the right place. The Discovering Your Mind podcast delves into all aspects of the mind's eye, including aphantasia, hyperphantasia, and everything in between. Welcome to the Discovering Your Mind podcast, brought to you by shanesbraindomain.com. I am your host, Shane Williams, also known as Shane's Brain. Today we're talking about aphantasia, visualization, and how it plays a role in communication. Our guest today is Ellis Pinkerton, who is a good friend of mine. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what you do there, Ellis?
Okay. So professionally, I've spent 30 years in the logistics, transportation, distribution realm. 20 of that in a leadership role, and so I've had teams as large as 450 and as small as 3. I've learned a lot about communication over that time, and so not that I'm a documented professional on the ins and outs of communication, but more of a life observer, somebody that, maybe on a scale of 1 to 10 views themselves as a 3 in terms of effective communication, but somebody that eventually wants to get above a 5. And so, I spend a lot of time thinking about it and going down rabbit holes of communication and how brains work and how people think and so forth. Coming up, I actually have a presentation in my professional world, and I'm going to be using aphantasia as a way to help people connect to the need for communication before presenting a proposed communication tool that would be used globally for our corporation.
In the realm of your professional life on a day-to-day basis, how important is communication?
On a scale of 1 to 10, it's a 10. I would say communication is one of the most, glossed over topics of being a human. I did some really quick searches, and it's interesting. One of the things that I came up with was what they call the 7-55-38% rule. 7% of our communication is verbal, 38% is tone of voice, and 55% is body language. And so if you think about that, and the fact that we're trying to do a podcast, and most of our communication is nonverbal, trying to take something that you feel and describe what that is, it's like the old adage, what does salt taste like? How do you describe what salt tastes like? And I would say a majority of the body language is probably unconscious thought. Body language is really conveying, what's going on inside. It's an outward expression of inward issues or emotion. And so a lot of times we can be saying something that is entirely masking how we really feel. And so that 7% isn't really communicating, the full extent of what is going on, right? So if you take that and you amplify that in your professional realm of your life, or your personal relationships, or, those with your family, you could have said something very benign from a verbal word count type of perspective, but said something entirely different based on the tone of voice that you used or the body language that you displayed when you did it. And so I would say that there's probably not very many great practitioners of communication. And so, my goal here today is to just kind of highlight communication and how aphantasia has helped me to see the need to communicate or to find different ways to communicate. And what I mean by that is communication is not necessarily just communicating in a method that I'm comfortable with. Sometimes it's communicating in a method that people want to receive communication in. If I'm talking to you in a way that's very off-putting, you're not going to hear what I say, right? And so being aware of that, I think is hugely important. And now understanding aphantasia and how people think is entirely different, how people visualize and see things is entirely different. I think it adds a new layer of opportunity to become a more clear communicator.
I think understanding how completely unique we are helps break down those barriers. We see the world through our experiences, right? We judge others based on our experiences, not on theirs. It's hard to communicate if you don't have an open mind to what someone else might be experiencing, especially in their mind, because for whatever reason, that's an assumption that everyone makes. I've been trying to expose the world to aphantasia for 25 years. I've been talking about it, and the one common thing is that, I just thought everybody did it the way I did it, right? Nobody thinks, everybody just assumes that we're all the same, and that is 100% absolutely untrue in every way.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. For me, you and I are on different ends of the aphantasia spectrum. So you have, for lack of a better term, you have a blank canvas, and mine's a messy desk, right? It's full of papers and books and pens and whatever. So for us to be able to communicate as well as we have over a period of years, I would say, looking back, one of the things that I had to realize is I can't just expect that people are going to make sense in the same way that I do of my messy desk, the way my brain works. I have to be able to take that visualization and turn it into something verbal so that you can process in your way what that is, right? And I think if we can figure out how to do that in our personal lives, in our professional lives, whatever, man, how much more successful are we going to be in selling our ideas to each other and communicating the way that we really feel, instead of just assuming that everybody sees things from the same perspective in the same light that we do. Do you feel like aphantasia is a hindrance or a superpower? And let me explain my question a little bit to you, because when you first told me about aphantasia, and you remember that conversation, and I was blown away that you can't see things because, like I've said, you're a super creative. You're very good with the written word. You're very good with visualizations. But the more time I've had to think about it, I actually think that it's kind of a superpower. I felt bad for you the first time you told me, and now I've kind of flipped that script. I think you're kind of lucky because, I'm on the other end of the spectrum where I picture everything for you. And so a lot of times when I'm being creative, I see something and I try to make it look like what I saw. And in doing that, I think sometimes I miss how much better it could be. And I've kind of heard a little bit of your creative process where you just start and you kind of fill in blanks as you go along. And I'm not so sure that having a picture to work off of is always the better thing, especially when you talk about communication. I would say one of my weaknesses is sometimes formulating what I'm going to say and not knowing how I'm going to feel about it in the moment when I have to say it. And maybe it's not the right thing to say, or maybe I feel different about it after hearing someone's perspective. And so then I'm stuttering and backtracking or trying to defend what I said because I feel like an idiot, right? And so I think maybe, having aphantasia isn't a bad thing at all. In fact, I would say it's more a blessing. Anyway, my question was, how do you feel about it?
So I think in some respects it is a superpower, because I don't think I would truly be me without it. I don't know if I could be the designer I am or the poet I am without it, because it's a blank slate, right? I've talked to some people where they can only picture things that they've seen before, where me, I have a blank canvas. So if I don't have any preconceived ideas about what something should look like or something
exactly
should be, right? I have now, when I design, I'm a graphic designer by trade. So when I design, if I'm designing a logo or I'm designing an ad, I will have general, vague ideas, but it doesn't happen until I get it up on the screen and try stuff. So a lot of times I'll have an idea, and then when I put it up on the screen, I'm like, oh, that was a bad idea. Now that I see it, I can see that's not going to work. And so I rework it, and I tweak things. I change colors because I can't do any of that in my mind. So I have to do it the way I do it. But the way I do it works. I'm good at it, and I've gotten really fast at it.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Would you say that you're more open to possibilities? Because I've found that to be true with you. You seem more open to accepting things that maybe you hadn't considered before, than maybe somebody like myself that feels like oftentimes I feel like I have things already figured out, and I can't be trifled with this idea that you're proposing until you make me stop and think about it. I think what you're describing is anything's possible until I see it, until I hear it, until I read it. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, I think in general, I'm pretty open-minded and always have been about certain things. But another thing that happens is I'll just draw blanks, or my mind will refuse to think. I have a very simple. It's just very simple. It doesn't like to be bothered with a lot of different things. So a lot of times it'll just like turn itself off. Like I don't even want to think about that. So a lot of times it is a hindrance because somebody else will have a clear, like you said, I understand. I know what we're going to do. And my brain's just sitting there, not like nothing. Just like, I don't know. So sometimes I think it might be nice to have a little more direction and thought about things. Sometimes it's just like nothing sparking. And the other thing is I just want to know what it's like, right? Like I would love to experience it, even if it's for just one day, or like, okay, Shane, you can now visualize, and then at the end of the day, you can decide if you want to keep it or not. Like I just want to know what it's like because it's so.
Take it on a test drive.
Yeah, because it's so outside my realm of understanding. I've talked to enough people now that I just like, okay, that's what it is. But inside I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't even wrap my head around it. It boggles my mind that such a thing is possible. So I would love to experience it if I could.
You're describing, so you don't see things. Your mind is a blank canvas all the time. So when you're drawing blanks and your brain refuses to work, what do you do to force it to do what you need it to do? Are there prompts or exercises, or what is it that you do to force the canvas to start creating, so to speak, in your way?
I panic. Seriously. Okay, you've seen me do stand-up comedy a couple times.
Yeah.
And one time, I think the first time you saw me forget what I was doing, right?
I did, yeah.
I have no resources. I have no way of pulling it up. And when you're on stage and you draw a blank, or when I draw a blank, It is blank. It is nothing. I have no techniques or anything to draw upon. It's quiet and dark, just like always. And I just have to hope it comes back. That's it. So what I try to do is just make light of it until hopefully it comes back. But luckily, the more I've done it, the less that happens.
Is that related to the rhythm of stand-up? Or, like, I guess my question is, how do you memorize something then? Because I would say for people on my end of the spectrum, the fantasy spectrum, I guess, I would do word associations, or I would picture a story in my head that I'm going to walk somebody through, right? So that I don't forget where I'm going. But how do you memorize then? Like, say you're set, how do you memorize 15 minutes of jokes?
For me, it's pure repetition. I just do it over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Read the book that inspired this podcast, Aphantasia and Beyond, available on shanesbraindomain.com and Amazon. Can you think of an example of how learning about aphantasia changed the way you communicate with others?
Yeah, definitely. I would say one of the things that I noticed is the immediate change for myself was I became more curious how a given audience, whether I was going to have a conversation with a team member or one of my leaders somewhere, I became more curious as to how they process things, how they see things. Are they more of a visual person? Are they more of an auditory person? Do they have aphantasia? Because I think if you can communicate in a way that they can, your audience can process, it makes your job, your life much easier instead of, the default setting of everybody feels the way that I feel or everybody sees things the way that I see. Or in your personal life, you're as a partner not thinking that it's your partner's responsibility to read your mind. It kind of forces us to communicate. And so it's created a curiosity in me as to how people think so that I can communicate better with them. It prevents me from putting my foot in my mouth, so to speak.
Right. And I think another thing that it does is it helps with being patient with others, or more understanding, lessens frustration. A lot of times, if you're trying to, explain something that makes perfect sense to you, you can't understand how can't you, why don't you see it? Why don't you understand it? You get frustrated, right?
Yep.
And just having that basic knowledge of their mind doesn't work the way mine does. They're having a totally different experience. It softens that. All of a sudden you can say, well, maybe let's try this way. Let's go about it a different way. Can you do it if we do it this way? It just
exactly.
lets you be more patient. It softens the frustration of why can't you do this? Why can't you see this?
Exactly. And what's the saying? Assumptions make an ass out of you and me. And I definitely found that to be true. Is instead of now thinking that this person's dumb or an idiot, it's they just see things differently. Right. They don't have a canvas. I have a canvas. Their tools are different, and so I need to step them down the path that I see, and let's see if we're thinking the same thing, so to speak. It's opened up opportunities where before I would have defaulted to frustration. Not that I still don't get frustrated, because I certainly do, but
right.
There's an explanation now for why we're not communicating.
Right. It's time for Aphantasia, the part of the show that lets you chime in and share your thoughts, insights, and experiences. Today we have Carrie Jensen chiming in. Today's question is, has learning about aphantasia affected how you communicate with others?
I get frustrated with other people. If I tell one of my guys at work, I need you to build me a ladder that's 6 foot tall, and I expect them to visualize it the same way I do. And I've had to really work on myself to know that people don't visualize things the way I do. And I have to give them a drawing, or I have to show them exactly what I want, do it once for them, and then they can do it.
If you would like to participate and hear yourself featured on the podcast, go to shanesbraindomain.com and click on the Aphantasia section. And I often think, too, about just the education system or teaching in general. When I first asked my dad if he could see pictures in his mind, his answer was, of course, everyone does. And he was a school teacher for 30 years.
Yeah.
And there's no way that didn't affect the way he taught. And I remember when I first discovered that I had aphantasia, when I first figured it out, I was in a college class, and the teacher told everybody to close their eyes and picture a tree. and I just saw darkness. And so, and throughout that class, I started to realize, I think other people are seeing stuff, right? That's during that class is when it dawned on me. But the reason I bring that up is he told everyone to close their eyes to visualize, right? Because that's the way he does it.
Yeah.
But not everybody does it that way. I've talked to people who cannot visual. They're highly visual, but they cannot do it with their eyes closed. So just little things like that, just knowing some of these little nuances and differences can change the way we teach. And I've been in, I've tried to do some of these visualization, meditation stuff. And the teachers, the ones teaching it, leading it, it's obvious that they're absolutely clueless that anybody is having a different experience than they are in their brains.
Exactly. Can you imagine how much more effective a teacher your dad would have been had he understood that not everybody was wired like he was wired? I think that that's a normal assumption. I think we're kind of hardwired to think that our experience is the same as everybody else's. And, how much more effective could we be as a parent, as a leader, as a coworker, as a husband, as a wife, whatever, if we would, through some natural curiosity, find out how those people that we need to communicate with process, how they think, how they learn. I think that would simplify our lives through just a little bit of natural curiosity. And I think this topic of aphantasia has kind of sparked that. Now I'm kind of naturally curious how people are wired. So say I'm visualizing a conversation that I have to have with a family member, a significant other, a team member. I actually visualize those conversations before I have those conversations. And so those things are typically completely auditory. There is no quote unquote visualization because the conversation, there's really nothing for me to visualize. There's no setting. I don't know how that conversation is necessarily going to take place, whether it's in a car or in a house. It's more just about, I'm going to say this, they're going to say that, I'm going to say this, they're going to say that. And I'll go through an entire conversation of talking points. And here's the interesting part. When it comes to auditory visualization, I'll even get to the point where I'll have an argument, a fake argument. And I know if I'm going to win or lose that argument based on their points and my points. And so a lot of times when that conversation actually plays out, I just skip to the end. I skip the whole conversation because I've already played it out, right?
Right. I've had somebody else tell me that exact same thing.
Okay.
Like,
yeah,
he'll play out an argument with his wife. I'll say this, and she'll say this. Then I'll say this, then she'll say this, and then she'll make a great point. I was like, oh, okay. And so I just skipped the whole argument.
Exactly.
And my wife wants to engage. I'm like, no, you've made your point. Even though she didn't say anything.
So
it's crazy.
This is why I asked you that question earlier. Is aphantasia a superpower? Because I would imagine, and you and I spend a lot of time talking to each other, and I love talking to you because it doesn't seem like anything that you say is contrived, pre-planned, premeditated in any way. And I find that to be very, very refreshing. And I would say that, this other person who has apparently the same, is on the same end of the spectrum as I am. I don't know that that's necessarily fair, because what if that's not what they would have said, right?
Right.
They could have said it, but that maybe that's not what they would have said. And I would say that that's one of the biggest issues with the way my brain works versus the way the brain works of other people that are in my life, right? I assume that they're going to say and do the things that I visualize. And I don't know that it's kind of convicting them of something that they haven't done yet, right? And so allowing things to play out has become a theme over the past couple of years, and not assuming and thinking that they're going to use the same levers that I would pull in a conversation, letting them have their own voice and actually going through those conversations. And I'll tell you, understanding that in aphantasia is one of the things that have helped me understand that. It's been one of the tools in the toolbox. I would say life is better turning the visualization down or off for a minute and just letting things play.
Is there a difference between professional relationships and personal, intimate relationships when it comes to communication and the role that visualization may or may not play?
Well, yeah, I think that there's some natural barriers in, if you were to compare personal relationships outside of your professional realm versus relationships in your professional realm. I think there's some natural barriers there. In a personal relationship, there's less of a worry, I would say, at least in my case. I'm less worried about being vulnerable in a personal relationship, where at work, I limit the amount of vulnerability that I display. And I would say that vulnerability can be sometimes the key to effective communication. If someone sees you as a robot, they're going to communicate with you as though you're a robot, versus if somebody knows that, you're not a robot and you're a walking, living, human being that has, wants, desires, failures, successes. And I think sometimes we can default our minds to think that people in our professional world are just those things. And so we're not vulnerable with them. And so, and in some cases too, we're there to do a job, right? We're not there to get personal with them and let them see who they are. And that's something I'm certainly guilty of. Is I would say very few people in my professional world know how I am outside of work. And so I think there are some natural barriers. The way that I think aphantasia has bridged the gap is not only did I not see the people in my professional world as being wired differently, I also didn't see that in my personal life. And so now, being naturally curious, I ask questions instead of making assumptions. I ask questions how people view things, and kind of the picture a horse question that you stepped several people through, but in a different way and probably less overt. Well, how do you see the problem? How do you see the way that they handled the situation? Those types of questions, but in a very similar realm. And from those questions, I can draw, okay, well, they're not a visual person. They're more of a blank canvas. They're more of an aphantasia. And so I definitely think that in addition to highlighting the need for natural curiosity and communication, I also think that it also brings into, aphantasia brings into the equation of communication and, an opportunity to see the answer differently than probably we ever have.
Yeah. And one of the things I've noticed too is just the depth of the relationship matters, right? So a lot of people that I deal with in a professional setting, I'm an introverted guy, so I prefer to do business through email. The people don't really get to know me that well. I don't really get to know them that well. And it doesn't really matter, right? We're able to communicate the way we communicate just fine. But when it comes to my wife, where there's a deeper level of relationship there, and we have to deal with each other a lot more often on a lot more different levels and different situations, then now all of a sudden it really becomes a really in-depth thing. And we discuss it all the time and have ever since we figured it out. It's helped us communicate so much better as two people who are so different from each other. I mean, we are worlds apart. And so how do you bridge that gap? Well, one of the ways we've bridged it is by understanding those differences. And aphantasia is one of them. My wife is highly visual. And so she's been able to, again, be more patient with me with certain things, understanding that I can't do what she can do in her mind. And other little nuances that I've discovered, things like when I say something disgusting, or gross or something, she has a much higher reaction to it than I do, because she's seeing it, right? She's visualizing it, she's picturing it, and so her reaction is much more, oh, that's gross. And it took me a while to figure out that difference. Like, oh yeah, that's why that bothers you so much more than it bothers me, because you're actually seeing it, experiencing it a lot more than I am. To me, it's just words, and I've already moved on, right? And once you delve into it, it really does affect communication and relationships on all sorts of different levels.
Yeah, I would say that, if you look at communication as an algebraic equation, right, and we're solving for X, I would say that X is the need to be understood, right? So, for instance, in professional worlds, there's a lot of talk about getting water to the end of the road, meaning that if the president has this initiative, it needs to get all the way down to everybody at the front line and all the way through the organization, right? So, and the analogy comes obviously from farming, where you open a valve and water runs out onto a field, and it gets to the end of every row where you've planted seeds, right? And so if water only gets to half of the field, then there's obviously something wrong with the way you've laid your field out, or the way you've plowed it, or yada, 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 yada. And so there's problems, I think, that are inherent in an organization that prevent the initiatives and the communication from getting all the way to the end of the road to water all of the seeds that the company has planted over a period of time, right? If the answer to the equation is to be understood, how much more effective of a communicator will we be if we understand that, for whatever reason? And I think that, man, what a fantastic, intriguing, study it would be to find out, why does someone have aphantasia and why does someone not, or have the opposite? Your synapses are wired differently, or whatever the scientific, findings might be down the road. It's interesting to note that because people see things, they perceive things differently, right? If we visualize or we don't visualize, that's going to have an effect on the way we perceive verbal communication, tone of voice, body language, visual cues, whatever the case might be. And I think the more that we understand that as an output communicator, will help the input, so to speak, perceive it the way that we're wanting it to be received or to be understood.
Right. So that made me remember a conversation I had with a guy. One of the things he said he does is, when he's trying to communicate, he'll have his thoughts, instead of just small little things, they come in like these giant essays. Like he said, my thoughts are so detailed and complex that it'll be like a giant essay, and I'll be trying to sum it up in, a couple sentences. And so he said it comes out kind of rushed and jumbled. And he said, sometimes I just wish I could just download what's in my brain into someone else's. There's too much. I can't say it all, and I can't explain it. It's just this giant essay, and I just wish I could just download it from my brain into yours. That's the only way he feels like he could really effectively communicate everything he's thinking.
Yeah, and I think he's probably not the only one that feels that way. I mean, if you think about human communication, it feels very primitive, that we're still stuck with, written language and verbal communication and so on, where it seems kind of intuitive that there should be a whole nother level of ability to communicate with people. And I think that there is. You talk to other people that can quote unquote read someone's energy, and that seems otherworldly. And while I kind of understand that, I also don't understand it. But yeah, I think that's why understanding aphantasia is so helpful, because I think there are other things that can hinder communication or help communication the more that we dive into them and understand them. I think aphantasia is one thing, and then there's probably several more that you can dive into. And I think the more that you understand those things, and the more that you understand how other people are obviously wired and how their brains work, it's going to dictate how successful you are as a communicator.
Yeah. It's definitely just one issue of many. And even within itself, it has tons of different layers and different things that affect it. I mean, talking about aphantasia and just the mind's eye visualization in general with people, it's just every time I do it, it's like, oh my gosh, it's just absolutely amazing how different everybody is. Share the gift of laughter with your children and grandchildren with books full of funny poetry and silly stories by Shane D. Williams, available on shanesbraindomain.com.
It's one of the challenges I've got is presenting a software program, basically an application to where people, it's basically like you've seen Microsoft Teams, but it's basically a Microsoft Teams, but where the president could interact with somebody right on the front line, where Teams is kind of limited to people at a corporate level, because say a driver, he's never at a computer, so he's never going to see that message. So you've got to get it on a mobile device. Several other opportunities there to communicate. But so for instance, in the trialing efforts of this software, of this application, in my world, we like to share safety experiences. So, hey, we had this safety event or this injury at this location. Here's the things we learned. Let's communicate the things that we learned in this way. Let's document it all out and post it, and then think that because we've posted it, that everybody understands it, right? And I think that kind of summarizes the way that most people choose to communicate. And what I found out is that that's not the way that people perceive those, and especially when you add a layer like software into the communication realm. So for instance, yeah, it's great that you posted it, but you posted it as a PDF. So now, unless that person has a PDF reader on their phone, they can't read it. And so when you have multiple generations of different phones and app stores and technical ability, now your audience shrunk from everybody, so water to the end of the road, to, yeah, you reach 75% where normally you would have reached 30%. But what I found that works better is picking a genre or a medium that is more broadly available. So for instance, instead of posting that share or that event as a PDF, which in the corporate world, everybody can open a PDF, but in the frontline world, posting it as a picture, because every device can open a picture, opens up the ability to go from 75% of the people communicated to 100% of the people, or maybe not 100, but 90% or 95%. And so just learning those nuances in a professional world, I think it's the same with aphantasia. Understanding that everybody's software is different, everybody's hardware is different. Software meaning, the kind of life we lived, the nature versus nurture, psychology struggle, and hardware versus, the DNA that we've been given and how we're, genetically predisposed to communicate. And so, seeing those things play out in the professional realm and seeing them play out in personal life and in, learning about aphantasia with you is, it's interesting how those things kind of just overlay on top of each other and mimic each other quite well.
Yeah, that is a great point. You're talking about, okay, how can this get to everybody? How can we cover everybody? And so it goes back to the teaching style. Okay, now that we're aware of it, how do we change our teaching style to reach everybody? I've gone to, some live TED events, TEDx. I've noticed several times in there the speakers will say, picture this, picture yourself here, or visualize, and all of a sudden now they're not reaching me the way they're reaching other people that can do that, right? So as a speaker, a TED speaker, whatever, once you have this knowledge now that not everyone can do it, how can I change my presentation? How can I do it maybe a little bit differently so that maybe I can better reach everybody? That's a great point.
Yeah, I think that works. I'll go back to, a previous conversation we had about natural curiosity, right? If you have something that you need to communicate, finding out or just understanding, even if you don't have the time to find out how they're wired, just the understanding that not everybody's wired the same way. So how do you communicate a point? Instead of saying, picture this, and just assuming everybody can picture this, say, picture this, or for you, maybe you need to write something down so that you can formulate a thought around and structure a thought around it. I don't know how that, I don't have that part solved 100%.
I don't either.
But posing it as a problem and the potential that if it's a problem before you even step into the software world, that adds another layer of complexity to communication. It creates as many problems as it solves, right? Giving a presentation or communicating to someone professionally or personally might make you more aware of how you are approaching a problem. I would imagine in your world as a graphic designer, somebody saying, well, can you make it just look like this? And you're like, well, what do you mean? That doesn't translate to the way that I process. I think understanding that not everybody visualizes now, it kind of opens the door for a potential to level up, so to speak, in our chosen method of communication, whatever that is.
Right. At least it at least gives you something to think about, right?
Yeah, especially if your goal is to be understood, you've got to make sure you've covered all the points of the equation. And if people are wired differently and you haven't taken that into account, the chances of being understood are minimized. And so figuring out how to convey the point to people that aren't visual, or to convey to the point that if people understand things better for what they hear, can you create a verbal prompt to help them understand, create a visual prompt for those that are visual, create a tactile prompt for those that are tactile learners or whatever, does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think another thing that comes into play is an open mind. For example, when I told you about aphantasia, you believed me, right? And then you incorporated it into your life and it's affected you. Where others, they hear about it and they dismiss it. That can't be true. You're making it up. I was listening to some guru one time, and obviously some people had told him he was all about visualization. That was part of his process. And he had people tell him that they can't do it. He just dismissed it, talked it down to everybody. And it's just like, click, like, you've lost me, dude. You've got to at least have an open mind that you don't know everything. The only person's mind we've ever been in is our own. We have these discussions trying to understand, but there's no way we can understand. And so to have the open mind to say, all right, your experience is valid and I don't know everything. That's a huge thing just right there, because if you shut it down the first time you hear about it, that's not real, then the communication is absolutely gone, 100% gone at that point.
I think for me personally, I can't speak for everybody, but being visual, I definitely would say that there have been several times where I became frustrated talking to someone that, looking back, obviously was not visual, right? And so I failed in that communication attempt. And I think when you have enough experiences like that, I think naturally you have to start wondering, well, I began to think that maybe I was broken, and instead what I found is I'm not broken and no one else is broken either. We're just having different experiences. And I think that going back to what I said before about natural curiosity, I think that's a key component in something that I've learned recently. But the more naturally curious I am, the happier and more peaceful my life seems to be, because instead of forcing everybody and everything in my world to fit a narrative or to fit a visualization that I've played out in my head 1,000 times, and just accepting the way that things are and understanding, the Eastern philosophy of two truths can coexist at the same time, right? Yeah. And it just, things are based on perspective and the light that you've shown on that truth, and transversely the same light that has been shown from a different perspective that someone else sees. And so understanding curiosity and why someone views things the way they do, to me, has become more important than proving I'm right. It's created a perspective of how am I wrong, or how did I not see that?
Right. Yeah. Once you embrace that you don't know anything, the whole world just opens up.
Possibilities. Once you wipe isn't that crazy? Once you wipe the canvas clean, you know.
That's right.
And
You can
you
design
open up
any logo
possibilities.
you want.
There you go. There you go. You're not trying to fit this narrative in your head or this preconceived notion for the way something has to be.
That does play a role in my job, because a lot of times, since I don't have any really preconceived ideas about what something should be, when I go through the work of designing and I solve all the problems as I go, right? Then when I get done, got all the little design things, like make sure the people are facing inward. You don't want to lead the eye out of the ad. Just all these colors go together. This foot, all these. So I solve all these riddles that come with each design. It's got to fit within these parameters. It has to say this. I do all that, and I feel like I've nailed it. And then I've got to send it off to somebody who doesn't understand all those things. They're coming at it from a completely different place, right? They probably pictured something completely different in their minds, and they don't know why I did what I did. They just want to start changing stuff. And so a lot of times they'll say, well, swap this picture out for this picture. Well, that picture doesn't work. It's facing the wrong way. It's not the right colors. It's not the right size, like everything about, but in their mind, it's just swap it out. The communication is tricky there, and it's definitely give and take, right?
So it sounds like you're talking to somebody that's formed a picture in their head of how they want that thing to look. And you showed them something that, that fits all of the design rules and all the parameters that were outlined, but because it didn't fit their narrative, they're frustrated with you. And how common does that sound, right?
Yeah. I didn't have a preconceived idea of what it was supposed to be. I built it based on my creativity and my knowledge and my skills, right? Yeah. And none of that translates to them. They don't know any of that. All they know is, well, this is what I want it to look like, right? And it's always different. Sometimes it's the people didn't really have a clear idea of what they wanted. So they just threw me a heap of trash, and I turned it into a beautiful thing. And they're like, oh my gosh, that is wonderful. They're like, because they didn't have anything formed, they're just happy that I was able to make something out of their jumbled mess.
Exactly. And I think that's probably the best analogy for aphantasia right there, is the person that probably didn't have a preformed, either they weren't artistic or they have aphantasia. They didn't form a visualization of how that thing should look. And so they were pleased with it because they didn't know what it should look like, right? Where somebody that is visual probably already had it all preformed, and they're upset with you because you didn't give them what they thought. Right. And how much does that sound like conversations with a spouse or a parent or a coworker or a boss, right? I think there's a lot of analogy in that dynamic, and how, I think where this needs to go is, how do we then overcome those gaps? And that's what I haven't quite put my finger on it, but I think, my the way I intend to use it, so I'm going to give this presentation, but the way I intend to use aphantasia is just another layer of how we are all wired differently, so to speak, how everybody's field is hoed differently. What are the size of the rows? How far apart are the rows? What kind of seeding did you use? How far apart are the seeds? And are there different watering apparatuses that you're using? And it's kind of all the same analogy, as it's kind of approaching farming. If, everybody did it the same way, you wouldn't have all the different types of tractors and yada, yada, yada that exist today. And so understanding that the software and hardware of people is different can certainly soften the approach to communication. And I also think also generates a natural curiosity in how to become a better communicator, both giving and receiving of information, right? With the end goal to eventually understand and to be understood.
Right. And I think it also matters, again, the depth of the relationship. So going back to designing for other people, I often say that I love designing. It's a lot of fun, but designing for other people can be a nightmare, right? And so when you were saying that, I was thinking about the depth of the relationship. Is this a one-time client, or is this a client I'm going to be working with for years upon years upon years? Depending on that answer, I treat it differently, right? Because this is just a one-time thing, and we just want to get this thing done, and I'm never going to work with these people again. I will just do what they want. They want it to look terrible. I'll make it look terrible. I don't care anymore, right?
So it's a transactional relationship, right? It's like pulling up to the McDonald's window, and when you're in a different town and you're never going to go back to that town, they don't care about you, right? They just want your money and give me my Big Mac, right?
Right. But on the other hand, I have some clients that I've worked with for, probably 15, 20 years at this point, because it was a deeper relationship and we're going to be doing this over and over. I have explained to them why I did what I did. This is why I did it this way, and this is why it's important. This is why the logo colors need to stay consistent. Or, you know what I mean? Because people will do all sorts of crazy stuff that breaks all sort of rules of, branding. And I've tried to establish that. I've tried to teach them what I know, right? The same thing happens with, other relationships. I'm going to spend a lot more time, figuring out how my wife ticks, and because I want that relationship to be good.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. How not every interaction or not every communication point is going to be one that you have the opportunity to explain your perspective or try to understand someone else's. It's more just a matter of, I got 5 minutes and I need to get this done and let's move on. But I would say a majority of the communication that you and I are talking about, and trust me, I would love, even in a transactional relationship, I would love to be able to communicate effectively. My goal is to get to a level 5 communicator. That's probably like level 6 or 7.
Right.
But in the types of communication that we're talking about, how much better can we be when we understand, here's what I'm seeing, here's what you're seeing. How do we bring those things together and find that common ground and make sure that I'm being understood and you're being understood mutually? We minimize the number of miscommunication points, not on just a single topic, but over a course of imagine a 20-year employee and the number of times that he's felt slighted because the water didn't get to the end of the row, and how much more we could have engaged that team member had we engaged them in a way that was more akin to how they assimilate knowledge, right? Definitely no easy task, but it's nice to know that it's nice to have the feather in the cap of understanding that this is one more way in which we differ as people.
That was a very good discussion. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Great insights. Fantastic. All right. Have a good one.
All right. We'll talk to you later.
All right. Bye.
See ya.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, follow, and engage with us, and share it with your friends and family as we continue to explore this fascinating subject. For additional information about this episode or Shane's Brain, check out the show notes. Thanks for listening to the Discovering Your Mind podcast. You are beautifully unique.